In the last section, we started talking about testing our code. We created a new file called deck_test.go, and now we're ready to start writing out some actual code that, hey, tests our stuff, right? Now, this is the part with every single testing framework, with every single language that I've ever worked with. I always get the same question, and that question is always, Stephen, how do we know what to test? Well, with Go, this actually usually ends up being a fairly straightforward question. So let's take a look at a quick diagram here. So I want to figure out, how are we going to decide what to test? In this case, let's think about our function newDeck. Now, the newDeck function has a decent amount of logic inside of it, right? Like if we look at the newDeck function inside of our code editor, so here's newDeck right here, we create an empty deck, we put together these two kind of starting lists of suits and values, and then we've got this nested for statement. And so I can very easily imagine many situations where another developer might come in here and they start messing around with stuff and start breaking code accidentally. And so I think that it's completely reasonable to say, maybe we want to write a test around this newDeck thing. But even then, I still get the question, well, what are we actually testing? Like, how do we write a test to make sure that newDeck is working the way we expect? And my answer to you, and the answer to all these test questions, is that it's up to you as the developer to just say, what do I really care about with newDeck? What do you really care about? Well, for me personally, when I think about the newDeck function, there's probably three things that I really care about, or three easy things I could very easily check. And if each of these little criteria are correct when I run my tests, it probably means that newDeck is working the way I expect. And so here's the three criteria. First off, I think that it makes sense to say that after we make a newDeck, we should have, say, 4 items inside of it. So let's assume that we're making a deck with 4 items or 4 strings, 4 cards. So maybe it makes a lot of sense to say, let's check the length of the deck that gets returned. And it should be exactly like 4 cards. I think that's a completely reasonable check, right? Maybe another thing that I would want to check is to make sure that the very first card in the deck is equal to Ace of Spades. And then maybe a third thing, that's a really easy and straightforward check, is to say that I want to make sure that the last card is equal to the 4 of Spades. And so there's really not a lot of trickery here or a lot of ambiguity. Whenever you write tests, just think about, well, what are some easy assertions, or what do I kind of care about with the code that I'm writing? You can write some tests around that, and honestly, that's kind of all there is to it. So let's take those 3 tests and figure out exactly how we might structure them inside of our test file. Okay, so this is going to be a nasty diagram, but we'll walk through it step by step. So whenever we identify a function that we want to test out of our real code, we're going to create a new function inside of our test file with the name of test and then the function that we're testing. So in this case, we will create a function called test_newDeck. And then inside of that function, we're going to write some code that makes some checks about a deck that we might make. So maybe the first check we put together is some code to make sure that a deck is created with a given number of cards. We make sure that the first card is an Ace of Spades, and then the last card is like a 4 of clubs, or whatever it might actually end up being. And then eventually, when we start to write tests around other functions as well, like say save to file or newDeck from file, which are 2 other functions that are very closely related, we might create another function called something like test save to deck and newDeck from file. And then we'll have some code that tests both of those functions inside that function as well. So that's the general approach that we're going to take here. Now, even at this point, you might be thinking, well, how are we going to write some code to make sure that a deck is created with a certain number of cards? Again, we're going to write some pretty basic or straightforward Go code to make sure that's the case. So in order to make sure that a deck is created with a certain number of cards, just walk through the process in your head. Like, what would we do? Well, maybe we would create a new deck. Maybe we would then write some if statement to make sure that the deck has the correct number of cards, or the number of cards that we expect it to have. And then if it doesn't, so if it fails this if statement right here, we'll tell our test handler, which is something that we'll talk about in just a second, exactly what this test handler is. We'll essentially notify our Go testing runner that something just went wrong and that this test in particular just failed. So let's give writing this test right here a shot and see how it actually looks in practice. So I'm going to flip back over to our decktest.go file. We're going to start off by writing out a function. So we're going to say func, and we're going to give it a name of test new deck, because that is the function that we are writing some tests around. So we'll say test new deck, like so. Now do notice that unlike many other functions that we've put together, this function has a capital T in the word test right here. You may have noticed when we were putting together our deck.go file that all the functions we put together inside of here were all lowercase. And there's actually a very good reason that we made these all lowercase, and we're making this one right here uppercase. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit in the next application we work on. Okay, so this function is going to be responsible for testing out the new deck function. Now the one really weird thing in here, and this is going to look a little bit weird, this function is going to be automatically called by the Go testing runner, or the Go test runner, with an argument that we referred to with the name of T, and it is of type star testing dot capital T, like so. And so this right here, the star testing capital T, yeah, it looks pretty strange, I agree. Remember that in a normal function call, this would specify the type of value that is being passed into the function. So we'll talk a little bit later about exactly what the star here means, but for right now, we'll just kind of leave it be. Okay, so again, let's focus on what we're trying to test here. We want to create a new deck. We'll then write an if statement to make sure that the deck has the right number of cards. And then if it doesn't, we'll tell that test handler that something just went wrong. So just to be clear, this T thing right here is our test handler. It's what we tell something, if anything goes wrong with our tests, we tell this value right here that something just went wrong. And we'll see what that looks like in practice very shortly. So we'll make a new deck. We'll then write out an if statement to make sure that the deck has the correct number of cards. So we'll say if the length of D is not equal to, and then we need to make sure that we actually get the correct number or the correct length right here. So if we go back to our deck.go file, remember that we have 4 suits and 4 values. So if you used more values than I did, you'll have a slightly different number. But assuming that you have 4 suits and 4 values, that would mean that you would end up with 16 cards. So back inside of our test over here, we'll say that we would expect our deck D to have 16 cards inside of it. So if the length of D is not equal to 16, that means that something went wrong. And we need to notify this test handler right here that something just went wrong. So we are going to write out t.errf, like so. And we're going to pass it a string that describes exactly what just went wrong. So we'll pass in a string that says expected deck length of 20, but got, and then we want to make sure that we actually print out the length that we did receive. So we'll close off the string, and then as a second argument, we'll pass in length of the deck, or len d. Sorry, let me get my zoom right. There we go. So now if the deck does not have 16 cards inside of it, we're going to notify the test handler that something just went wrong, and we're going to give it the error message, expected the thing to have a length of 20, but instead we got blah, whatever the length actually was. So that's pretty much it for our first test. Let's save this file and then run it to see what happens. Now the instant I save the file in VS Code, you'll notice that we get an import statement for testing right here. Again, if you're not using VS Code, if you're using some other editor, make sure you add the import statement here. So now to run our tests, we can either use the built-in VS Code helper right here and just click Run Test. Alternatively, we can flip back over to our terminal and run the go test command. Okay, so when I do, we get this nice big message that says pass. Looks like all of our tests successfully were executed. Now just to make sure that we wrote our test out correctly, and by the way, you'll notice a little green squiggly here with a warning. We'll talk about what that is in just 2 seconds. But first, to make sure that we have an actual functioning test here, we'll change the length from 16 to something like, I don't know, 2000 to make sure that our test is actually working correctly. And so now when we run it, we get this nice, nasty little error message that says, okay, we ran deck test, we expected deck length of 20, but got blah. So something clearly went wrong here. Okay, let's now resolve this little error message or this little warning here. So you'll notice that it says, and let me close my sidebar really quick here so you can see the whole line. There we go. So this little error reporter right here is what we call a formatted string. And so a formatted string means that we can pass in some extra values and then have those get automatically injected into the string that we provide as the first argument. And so essentially what this wants us to do is it's saying, hey, you're passing in this extra value right here, length of D. You need to actually make use of that value and inject it into the string right here. So in order to inject it into the string, we're going to go to the very end of the string and then say %v, like so. So that means use a string of expected dec length of 20, but got blank. And this %v right here will be taken from whatever value we passed in right here. So let's run this code again and now see what happens. So we'll run go test. And when we do so, we see expected dec length of 20, but got 16. And you know what? I just realized, yeah, we put in a bad description there. I put in 20, I meant to say 16. But clearly it is working because our dec length is not 2000, and that's why we saw the error message in the first place. So we'll fix this back to 16. So we got 16, 16, everything looks good. Let's run our test one more time, and we're back to passing. Now again, of course, if you want to, you can make use of these built-in helpers with VS Code by clicking the Run Test button, and it'll pop open a little output console down here that just runs that one particular test, and then prints the output out and tells you whether or not the test passed. And so this Run Test button right here is most helpful when you're working on a project with many, many different tests inside of it. And so you can just say, just run this one test, don't run everything. I just want to know how this one singular test is doing. Okay, so that's a lot on testing. Let's take a quick break. We're going to come back in the next section and we're going to write out a couple more tests inside this file. So I'll see you in just a minute.